The German philosopher Immanuel Kant offers his explanation of the Enlightenment in his tract What is Enlightenment, written in 1784. He writes, "The Enlightenment requires nothing but freedom. Freedom to make public use of one's reason in all matters. Now I hear the cry from all sides. Do not argue, the officer says. Do not argue, drill. The tax collector. Do not argue, pay. The pastor. Do not argue, believe. Only one ruler in the world says, argue as much as you please, but obey." We find restrictions on freedom everywhere. But which restriction is harmful to enlightenment? Which restriction is innocent? And which advances enlightenment? I reply, the public use of one's reason must be free at all times, and this alone can bring enlightenment to mankind. A couple of things to notice in this tract. One is Kant's use of reason and rejection of dogma. Whether it be the police or whether it be the tax collector or whether it be the church, Kant is going to tell us reason must determine our actions, not blind belief. Another thing that characterizes the Enlightenment, according to Kant, is that reason is to be used publicly. This is not just for private endeavors, and that's going to come into fruition in something we call the public sphere in coffee houses and in salons. The other thing is that he singles out both secular authority and ecclesiastical authority as inimical to freedom. He believes that using reason is the best way to approach enlightenment and not receive our understanding from some other source. There are some other things that characterize the Enlightenment. The first is that it represents an expansion and a popularization of the scientific revolution. If you recall, the scientific revolution was something that really only elites experienced. It was something that only educated people and universities experienced. The Enlightenment is going to be a much more far-reaching phenomenon, although by no means fully democratic. Secondly, it reflects new ideas that emerged from the Age of Exploration from 1492, essentially, when Columbus first discovered America, to about 1700 or so, when Captain Cook discovered Australia. And it was fueled by the readable and popular philosopher John Locke, whose treatise on government and on human understanding was the textbook for many Enlightenment thinkers, all of which we will explore in the next few slides. So when I speak about the popularization of the scientific revolution, I can give you two passages that I think illustrate this. Take the first one from Isaac Newton. "For since the potentials of bodies are only known to us by experiments, we are to hold for universal such as universally agree with experiments, and such are not liable to diminution, can never be reduced, either in consequence nor in attitude. We are certainly not to relinquish the set evidence of experiments for the sake of dreams and vain fictions of our own devising." Okay, everybody get that? Try this one out. This one's not by Isaac Newton, but by an Enlightenment writer named Bernard de Fontenelle. He writes, "There came upon the scene this German fellow, one named Copernicus, who made short work of all those various circles, all those solid skies, which the ancients had pictures in themselves. He was fired up with the noble zeal of a true astronomer. He took the earth and spun it very far away from the center of the universe, where it had been installed, and in the center he put the sun, which had a far better title to the honor." So what's the difference between the two? Well, Isaac Newton is a very bright guy, and his works are very important, but he's not generally accessible to the average reader. Whereas Bernard de Fontenelle puts things in a way that everybody can understand. So Fontenelle and a lot of Enlightenment writers are essentially hacks. They're guys who rip off ideas from the great thinkers, and they don't pass them off as themselves, but what they do is they make them accessible. They popularize them, and they put them into books and into tracts, so anybody at a coffee shop can pick them up and start discussing. Remember the Age of Exploration back from your A-push or your dual credit class? What happened when Christopher Columbus first bumped into the Caribbean thinking it was India in 1492? Did he give a whole lot of thought to learning about other cultures and languages? Did he give a whole lot of thought to the relative nature of goodness as expressed by the natives? No, he said, let's convert them, let's make them exactly like us. And the Spanish missionaries, the conquistadors, went out and did just that. The English were no different, believing that the Indians had to either convert or die. By 1700, after Captain Cook had explored the South Pacific and Australia and New Zealand, he wrote about the indigenous peoples there. What is still more to our shame as civilized Christians, we debauch their morals already too prone to vice, and we introduce among them wants and perhaps disease, which they never before knew, and which only serve to disturb that happy tranquility which their forefathers enjoyed. If anyone denies the truth of this assertion, let him tell me what the natives of the whole continent of America have gained by the commerce they have had with Europeans. So a couple of things to notice about James Cook. One, the discovery of new lands is going to lead to new ideas and new peoples. Enlightenment thinkers begin to perceive truth as relative and not fixed. And so if everything is relative, who is to say what is right and wrong? A third influence is the philosopher John Locke. In his essay on human understanding, written in 1690, he wrote, "Let us suppose the mind to be, as we say, white paper, that is tabula rasa, void of all characters, without any ideas. How comes it to be furnished? Whence comes it by that vast store, which the busy and boundless fancy of man has painted on it with an almost endless variety? Whence has it all the materials of reason and knowledge? To this I answer in one word, from experience, in that all our knowledge is founded, and from that it ultimately derives itself. Our observation, employed either about external sensible objects or about the internal operations of our minds, perceived and reflected on by ourselves, is that which supplies our understandings with all the materials of thinking." So John Locke believes that our minds are blank slates. They're literally empty at birth. There's nothing there. Nothing about morality, no critical thinking, no preconceived ideas. We come out completely blank. Therefore, everything, our thoughts, our morals, our precepts, everything is the result of human experience. And so the consequence is that we can be essentially programmed. We can be made to be good. We are not all naturally bad. We're not naturally good. The human enterprise is one that we can write ourselves. As I said, the Enlightenment is a general movement that started in France to broaden and to make accessible the thinking of the scientific revolution. At the forefront of this movement is a group of French intellectuals known as the Philosophes. The Philosophes proclaimed that they were bringing the light of knowledge to their fellow creatures in what they consciously considered to be the age of reason. So who are these Philosophes? Well, first of all, they're not scientists and they're not philosophers. They're not the guys doing the actual research. They're popularizers. They're mostly upper middle class men. They're those who have the time and the leisure to meet in salons or in coffee shops and to do this kind of thinking. They're centered in Paris, which is the white-hot nerve center of the Enlightenment, but they're part of an international community that includes places like England and Germany and Scotland. And they're generally committed to talk, but not social reform. Most of them are known for their writings and for their words, but not necessarily for their actions. Lastly, the thing that characterizes the Philosophes is their radical skepticism. Whether they're talking about politics or religion, Everything is going to be subject to reason and experience. There are no sacred cows with the Philosophes. I think that the Philosophes program can be summed up in this document called The Progress of the Human Mind. Would it be absurd now to suppose that the improvement of the human race should be regarded as capable of unlimited progress? That a time will come when death would only result from extraordinary accidents or the more and gradual wearing out of vitality, and that finally the duration of the average interval between birth and wearing out has itself no specific limit whatsoever? No doubt man will not become immortal, but cannot the span constantly increase between the moment he begins to live and the time when naturally, without illness or accident, he finds life a burden? In other words, what can the human mind not accomplish? Is it too far-fetched to assume that if we put all of our cognitive powers to the task, we cannot find a way to prolong life indefinitely? This, to me, is the ultimate goal of the philosophe. They love life so much that they hope to improve it, to expand it, and to find and engineer ways of making life accessible to everybody for as long as we can. And so here's the who's who, here's the lineup of the philosophes that we're going to be talking about in this section. The first guy is named Montesquieu, then we have Voltaire, we have Diderot, and we have David Hume. And there's one other I need to mention who doesn't really fit, but he is still a philosophe nonetheless. He's called Rousseau, and he's something of an outlier, and we'll understand why in just a little bit. So we'll begin with the Baron de Montesquieu. He's a French writer and philosophe born in 1689 and died in 1755. He's popular for something he wrote called the Persian Letters. This is social satire supposedly written by two Persians walking around France. And so what it enables him to do, as it functions as a filter through which Montesquieu can directly criticize his own society. The thing is that, he writes, for every man who has any post at court in Paris or in the country, there is a woman, through whose hands pass all the favors and sometimes the injustices that he does. These women are in touch with one another and compose a sort of commonwealth whose members are always busy giving each other mutual help and support. So the Persian Letters here, Montesquieu is poking fun of the sexual politics and gender relations and the presumed status quo regarding men and women, but he's doing it in a safe way by using these two Persians, supposedly, and using them as mouthpieces. He can avoid directly criticizing his own society, which is not a safe thing to do in 18th century France. As much as the Persian Letters may make some people chuckle, Montesquieu is best known for his political treatises. He lived in absolutist France, but he wrote The Spirit of the Laws, which is a Republican manifesto. It's a comparative study of monarchies, republics, and despotisms, in which he concludes, in every government there are three sorts of power: the legislative, the executive, in respect to things dependent on the law of nations, and the executive in regard to the things that depend on the civil law. There would be an end of everything where the same man or the same body, whether of the nobles or of the people, to exercise those three powers, that of enacting laws, that of executing public resolutions, and that of judging the crimes of differences of individuals. Essentially, what we get from this is the spirit of the laws advocates separation of powers, separating the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branches of government in order to keep power from becoming concentrated in one area. And of course, as you know, this is the thinking that informs the American system of government, which we have a president, a Congress, and a Supreme Court, all with checks and balances on the other to keep power from becoming concentrated in one branch. Now, the second guy we're going to look at, his name is Voltaire. He is certainly the most famous philosophe, born in 1706 and dies in 1749. He's an upper-class Frenchman who made his living making fun of upper-class Frenchmen. He was a wanted man in France for publishing so much that insulted the nobility, so much so that he had to go to England for 3 years, and there he became enamored with the relative English liberty that he experienced in contrast to French absolutism. And he writes on religion. If there were just one religion in England, despotism would threaten. If there were two religions, they would cut each other's throats. But there are 30 religions, and they live together peacefully and happily. The English, as a free people, choose their own road to heaven. Here the nobles are great without insolence, and the people share in the government without disorder. So obviously he's taking a look at the relative English freedom that people had with regard to religion, thanks to the Glorious Revolution and the settlement there, and he's also speaking of the republican form of government that has been expanding since 1689 and continues to give the people, and of course it's still landowning men, but the people more of a voice in government. Voltaire finds this very attractive and will continue to be a great admirer of the English until he dies. Well, Voltaire returned to France, where he met and began a lifelong relationship with a wealthy and educated woman named Madame du Châtelet. Now, she lives near the French border, which is very opportune for Voltaire, because whenever the authorities would sense that he was nearby, he could just slip across the border and then come back at his leisure. Now, Châtelet read widely and translated Newton into the only French copy that existed at the time, but she was nevertheless turned away from the Royal Academy of Science in Britain. She continued to write and used Voltaire as her mouthpiece anyway. Now, this is not to say that Voltaire was not a bright guy and a very educated and influential writer and speaker in his own right. He certainly was, but nonetheless, we have to look at Voltaire as somebody through whom women can speak through, and he was not unhappy to serve in that capacity. The Madame de Châtelet says, "Were I an absolute ruler, I would reform an abuse which cuts off, so to speak, half the human race. I would make women participate in all the rights of mankind, and above all, in those of the intellect." So she is a very early voice of feminism, demanding that women take an equal share in the intellectual life of Europe. With regard to religion, Voltaire was no less unorthodox and controversial. He had very little use for traditional religion. He thought of priests as foolish and dogma as mere superstition. He advocated for complete religious tolerance. He thought that governments functioned best when they allowed anybody to believe whatever they wanted for any reason, but he nevertheless always held a special grudge against the Catholic Church, which he thought of as particularly hierarchical and oppressive, and he is very well known for his phrase, "crush the infamous thing," in which he means the Catholic Church. Now, this is not to say that Voltaire is an atheist. He's not. He believes in a God, but for Voltaire and others like him, God is a divine, or like a divine watchmaker, and the watch is his world. God is therefore simply allowing the earth to run by natural law. That's nature's God, as Thomas Jefferson put it in the Declaration of Independence, and he doesn't likely intervene. So the idea of a personal God who's reigning from on high, watching everybody and intervening through miracles, doesn't make a whole lot of sense to Voltaire. For him, to love God and love your neighbor are religion enough. These religious views are put by a former priest named Joseph Addison, who wrote a poem, "The spacious firmament on high, with all the blue ethereal sky, and spangled heaven a shining frame, their great original proclaim. The unwearied sun from day to day does his Creator's power display, and publishes to every land the work of an almighty hand. Addison writes that God's work is evident in nature, not in doctrinal creeds and not in church confessions. This is a religious outlook that's based on a Newtonian view of the universe, and ironically, Newton would not agree with this, but it does see the universe as being run and governed by natural law and not by divine intervention. It is based on the scientific revolution. But interestingly and ironically, I think this idealization of nature also anticipates the Romantic period. Voltaire wrote the great name of deist, and that's what he calls himself, and that's what people who follow this sort of religion call themselves. The great name of deist, which is not sufficiently revered, is the only name one ought to take. The only gospel one ought to read is the great book of nature, written by the hand of God and sealed with his seal. The only religion that ought to be professed is the religion of worshiping God and being a good man. So you can see there, deism is a rational, or claims to be a rational form of religion, and it is nature-based. And so ironically, I think that deism eventually gives way in some sense to Romanticism. Now, as we said, Voltaire hated the Catholic Church, and he didn't much care for traditional Christianity, but he was a very strong proponent of complete religious toleration. He writes, "What is tolerance? We are all full of weakness and errors. Let us mutually pardon our follies. This is the last law of nature. Of all religions, the Christian ought doubtless to inspire the most tolerance, although hitherto the Christians have been the most intolerant of all men. Tolerance has never brought civil war. Intolerance has covered the earth with carnage. Fanaticism is to superstition what delirium is to fever, what rage is to anger. What is a persecutor? He whose wounded pride and furious fanaticism arouses princes and magistrates against innocent men, whose only crime is that of being of a different opinion. It does not require great art or magnificently trained eloquence to prove that Christians should tolerate each other. I, however, am going further. I say that we should regard all men as our brothers." What? The Turk, my brother? The Chinaman, my brother? The Jew, the Siam? Yes, without a doubt, we are not all children of the same Father and creatures of the same God? And as I said, I think it's one of the great historical ironies that deism, which wants to distance itself from what it thinks of as irrational Christianity or irrational faith, actually finds a great expression in Romanticism. This is a poem by William Blake. Just compare it, if you will, to the last thing that we just read on Voltaire. "Mercy has a human heart, pity a human face, and love the human form divine, and peace the human dress. Then every man of every clime that prays in his distress, prays to the human form divine, love, mercy, pity, peace. And all must love the human form in heathen, Turk, or Jew. Where mercy, love, and pity dwell, their God is dwelling too." The American Philosophes, they are also famous deists. I know that we've said this a couple of times in U.S. history courses, but you have Benjamin Franklin, you have Thomas Paine, and you have Thomas Jefferson, all of whom, to some degree or another, consider themselves to be deists. We turn our attention now to a man named Denis Diderot. Denis Diderot is the Enlightenment's great organizer. Notice we said that most of these guys are not going to be philosophers and they're not going to be scientists. Most of them are disseminators of work that has gone before them. This is absolutely the case with Denis Diderot. With his friend Jean Rondeau-Humbert, he compiled and published what is called the Encyclopedia, the rational dictionary of the sciences, arts, and the crafts. Now, what this is, it's 72,000 articles, and it kept growing until Diderot died. 72,000 articles by scientists, writers, workers, and even progressive priests. No aspect of human life is going to be unexamined. There are no sacred cows in Diderot's Encyclopedia. He wrote, "The aim of the Encyclopedia is to collect all the knowledge scattered over the face of the earth, to present its general outlines and structure to the men with whom we live, and to transmit this to those who will come after us, so that the work of past centuries may be useful to the following centuries, that our children, becoming more educated, may at the same time become more virtuous and happier, and that we may not die without having deserved well of the human race. All things must be examined, debated, investigated without exception and without regard for anyone's feelings." And if you look at the title page of the encyclopedia, a lot of these themes are illustrated well. At the top there, that's truth. And sitting right next to her, that's the personification of reason. And just below reason is Lady Philosophy, who shows up in Boethius. And then below them are the unwashed masses. So you get this sort of elitism here. Truth being disseminated through reason and philosophy, accessible through philosophy, is eventually going to get down there to the average person like you and me. And this is the purpose of the encyclopedia, to make these truths, to make the great truths of the scientific reformation or revolution available to you and me. And now we can turn our attention to a man named David Hume. He was not a Frenchman, he was a Scotsman, a Scottish philosopher who lived from 1711 to 1776. His treatise on human nature, published in 1739, was strongly influenced by John Locke's theory about human development on the blank slate theory, the tabula rasa theory. And he agrees with that tabula rasa formulation, that we are born without anything inherent, no knowledge or inclination is inherent to us, but he goes even further and explains what he calls the emotive theory of values. Let me explain. David Hume would ask you, what are you seeing? What are you hearing? And what are you feeling? And you may respond, well, I'm looking at my computer, or I'm looking at my desk, or I'm looking at a book, or something like that. And David Hume would reply, no, you're not. You don't know what you're seeing, what you're hearing, or what you're feeling. You only know what you think you see, hear, or feel. And that's because you only know what your senses tell you, not as things are. Your knowledge of the world is obscured by the media through which you see the world. That simply means that you're dependent on your senses. You're dependent on your eyes and your ears to tell you what the world is like, and then that information is interpreted by your brain, and so it goes through several filters before you can actually make a judgment on what you're seeing. So for example, you might say, well, I see a cat. But you don't see a cat, because what your eye tells you is a cat is then interpreted by the brain. And Hume says that ideas, like when you think of that cat, are only less vivid copies of sense impressions, and that there is nothing in the mind that wasn't first in the senses. The emotive theory of values. You see an act, you see something happen, and then your brain interprets its ethical value, manifesting an emotional response. This means that all morality is relative to your impressions, which is relative to your emotions, and so For example, you see a murder and I see a murder. I interpret this as a horrible thing, and you're kind of a scoundrel and you interpret it as a good thing. And therefore, what is it? Is murder bad? Is murder good? Well, no, it's neither one. In fact, it's a neutral event to which we have different emotional responses. And therefore, if we have different emotional responses to an event, then that must mean that God does not exist. And if you want to know more about that, you should take philosophy. Now, I mentioned earlier that Rousseau is something of an anomaly among the Philosophes. His opinions run contrary to their general program. He's best known for his work Emile, which, as we recall from our lecture on ordinary people, is about child rearing. And unlike his fellow Philosophes, he's skeptical of science, he's skeptical of what they consider to be progress, and he's skeptical of modern views of society. He puts this all down in 1750 on the Discourse on the Moral Effects of the Arts and Sciences, and the discourse, the moral effects, that is nothing good. He argues that civilization and enlightenment have had a corruptive and coercive effect on human nature rather than improving it. And he continues his discussion in the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, published in 1755. There, he goes forward and says that the root of all evil is the uneven distribution of property, and he specifically calls out private property. In his Discourse on Inequality, Rousseau writes, "The first man who, having enclosed a piece of ground, bethought himself of saying, 'This is mine,' and found people simple enough to believe him, was the real founder of civil society. From how many crimes, wars, and murders, from how many horrors and misfortune, might not any one have saved mankind by pulling up the stakes, or filling up the ditch, and crying to his fellows, 'Beware of listening to this impostor! You are undone if you once forget that the fruits of the earth belong to us all, and the earth itself to nobody.'" So, for Rousseau, private property is the cause of society, and society is evil. And the earth doesn't belong to one person or to one corporation or one association of people. It is a crime to declare these things. The earth is the property of everyone. Private property is bad. Well, if you look deeply enough, you can see that he's obviously attacking the practice of enclosure and the rise of the market economy and its effects on society and the peasants that he loves so much. And so you have to ask, does this beg the question, is Rousseau the first communist then? Now we have a rather lengthy passage from Rousseau's Social Contract, published in 1762. It's long, but hang with me, because I'm going to explain the whole thing afterwards. Rousseau writes, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains. The problem is to find a form of association which will defend and protect the whole common force, the person and goods of each associate, and in which each, while uniting himself with all, may still obey himself alone, and remain as free as before. This is the fundamental problem of which the social contract provides the solution. The causes of this contract, properly understood, may be reduced to one: the total alienation of each associate. That means the abandonment of the individual, together with all his rights, to the whole community." You see what's happening here? You have to give up your individual rights, your individual understanding, and you cede that to the community. "For," he writes, "each of us puts his person and all his power in common under the supreme direction of the general will. And in our corporate capacity, we receive each member as an indivisible part of the whole. In order, then, that the social compact may not be an empty formula, it tacitly includes the undertaking which alone shall give force to the rest." Now, pay attention. What if I do not want to obey the general will? "Whoever refuses to obey the general will shall be compelled to do so by the whole body. The general will alone can direct the state according to the object for which it was instituted, that is, the common good." So let's distill that down to its basics. For Rousseau, private property is the root of all evil. Private property leads to civilization, which corrupts human nature. Rousseau believes we exist best in a state of nature. Nature is naturally good. Nature is naturally cooperative, and our human nature wants to share and not beat each other up. So he's something of the opposite of Thomas Hobbes. So the question that Rousseau wants to answer with the social contract is, how can we have both the protection and benefit of the state, of a human society, and maintain our humanity? And his answer is the social contract. It's an association in which individuals surrender their individual rights and their individual personhood to something called the general will. And that's expressed in terms of a radical direct democracy, the outcome of which you must obey, or, Rousseau says, we will force you. Whoever refuses to obey the general will, Rousseau writes, shall be forced to obey it by the whole body politic, which means nothing else than that, the paradoxical statement, he will be forced to be free. It's a very interesting thing to contemplate. Now, the social contract has been the source of many future governments. And one has to ask, does the social contract, of which bears so many associations, does it have more in common with this, our founding fathers, or with this, totalitarian states of the 20th century? It has association with both. You decide. There are some important questions to consider when talking about the Enlightenment. For example, did it happen in the cities or in the country? Did it happen more among men or among women? What about the class difference? What about the upper class, the middle class, or the lower class? Did it happen among Protestants or Catholics, in absolutist regimes, or in republics? This map is useful when we're trying to make some inferences about where the Enlightenment took place. We may want to go right to Protestant areas and say, well, that's going to be the likely place. They're challenging authority there. They are less likely to be bound by the strictures of an authoritative church or something like that. And we can draw that conclusion perhaps if we look at Spain, where there's very little bit of Enlightenment activity happening. But then we look over in Italy, which is primarily Catholic, and you see there's a lot of famous European academic centers and publications of scientific and philosophic journals happening. So that doesn't hold true. Look up to England. England is primarily Protestant and a center of the scientific revolution, and we're invited to think, yes, that's where it's happening as well. But then we look down to France and we say that a similar thing is happening. So no, you can't say that this is primarily a Protestant phenomenon, especially when you consider that France is primarily Catholic. Is it in urban areas? And you can say, yes, the Enlightenment is happening primarily in urban areas. It's not happening in small towns or villages. It's where there's a lot of people and a lot of discussion going on. I think that this map provides us an even better gauge when we're trying to assess where the Enlightenment took place. This is a map that details the subscriptions to Diderot's Encyclopedia. And as you can see, yeah, they go around as far as Ireland, or you can see a few in London. There's even a few subscriptions out there in Warsaw. But where are the majority of the subscriptions to Diderot's Encyclopedia? They are in France. Without a doubt, we can say that France was the undisputed leader of the Enlightenment in Europe, and Paris is the white-hot nerve center of Enlightenment activity inside of France. But the question remains, why? This seems like a very unlikely place for something such as the Enlightenment to happen. After all, France is the most authoritarian government that we have in all of Europe, with the exception of perhaps autocratic Russia. Louis XIV is the one in charge of France, Mr. I am the state himself. France has a very strong church-state relationship, second perhaps only to Spain. Remember, the Huguenots were officially outlawed and not allowed to exist. France also has the strictest censorship laws. Despite the fact that Diderot's Encyclopedia is circulating throughout the country, it's officially illegal. You're not supposed to be reading it. And also, France was probably the last or one of the last countries to embrace the scientific revolution, especially the changes that took place with regard to agriculture. And this is one of the reasons why France was starving so much on the eve of the French Revolution. It's because they had not yet adopted some of the crops and some of the procedures that are going to enhance crop yields. So these are questions that historians have been debating for at least the last century. Why France? Why authoritative France? Why not England? Why not somewhere else with a more flexible and inviting political environment? And what we can say is, and what I can offer you is, maybe it happened in France because of those reasons, not in spite of them. Perhaps it was the strict and authoritative presence of the crown and the church that caused people to rebel, whereas in England there was less reason to rebel. We can point to something else happening in the late 18th century, and that is something called the Reading Revolution. European production and consumption of books grew dramatically in the latter half of the 18th century, and this is mostly due to the spreading of printing technology, which encourages literacy, which encourages universities, which encourages literacy, and you can see where this is going. For example, in Germany, new titles grew from 600 in 1700 to 2600 by 1780. Universities that developed in the scientific revolution played a role in disseminating texts, and they made a big business out of literacy, establishing bookstores and having required readings. And the nature of reading began to change in the late 17th century as well. People began to read less about religion, and devotional books were on the decline. Law and history remained steady, and what became more and more widely read were practical arts and sciences. Have a look at this data. In 1683, just 51% of urban France was literate. By 1770, it's jumped to 60%. Have a look at rural Normandy. In the late 17th century, 37% of males were literate and 7% of females. And look at this data. Late 18th century, 73% of males and 46% of females. In the German states, around 1500, only 3 to 4% were literate. By 1800, 50% were literate, and of course, mostly men. There's one other important factor that we cannot overlook, and that is the coffee. Tradition has it that an Ethiopian goat herder discovered the benefits of the coffee bean when he was looking over his flock and discovered that after feeding upon a certain bush, they became rather frisky. Coffee became all the rage throughout the Muslim world. They said it was black as soot and not tasting much unlike it. And it's found its way to Europe. The first coffee shop opened in Vienna in 1645, then London by 1650, and finally Paris in 1672. Coffee stimulates conversation. Coffee stimulates discussion. Coffee stimulates debate. And just as the reading revolution began to gain traction in Europe, so too did our beloved coffee bean. In London, they were known as penny universities because just about anybody could walk in off the street and for a relatively low cost pick up a newspaper, pick up a book, pick up a pamphlet, and engage in some of the smartest conversation in all of the city. A London newspaper, the London Spy, speaks of a coffee shop as this: There were a rabble going hither and thither, reminding me of a swarm of rats in a ruinous cheese store. Some came, others went. Some were scribbling, others were talking. Some were drinking coffee, some smoking, and some arguing. The whole place stank of tobacco like the cabin of a barge. On the corner of a long table, close by the armchair, was lying a Bible. Beside it were earthenware pitchers, long clay pipes, a little fire on the hearth, and over it a huge coffee pot. Behind a small bookshelf on which were bottles, cups, and an advertisement for a beautifier to improve the complexion was hanging a parliamentary ordinance against drinking and the use of bad language. Had not my friend told me that he had brought me to a coffee house, I would have regarded the place as a big booth of a cheap jack. In Paris, the situation was different. Here, the philosophes met not in a loud and rambunctious coffee shop, but in a Parisian salon. Now, these were social gatherings typically held in somebody's home, and they were held by the rich and the talented of Paris. This is where the philosophes and their followers met to discuss the latest literature, science, politics, and philosophy. Now, the salon differed from a coffee shop. It was more aristocratic and exclusive. You didn't just walk in off the street and for a penny engage in smart conversation. It was typically by invitation only. It was a meeting of both educated nobility, and most of the nobles, by the way, did not approve of the Enlightenment. So it was mainly the prosperous bourgeoisie or the middle class. The environment was free from censorship or religious dogma, and critical thinking was the order of the day. If you were there to be dogmatic, be gone with you. And an interesting development in the salons were that they were presided over by wealthy, graceful, elegant, and educated women known as salonières. So if we turn back to our portrait of a typical Parisian salon, there's a couple of things to notice. First, these are aristocratic men, and they're meeting in an environment that looks a little bit more like a museum than a bar. Also, you'll notice that there's a bust of Voltaire in the background, sort of silently presiding over all of their comings and goings. And the third thing I want to point out is that there are a number of women among them, the salonières. Now, who are these women? It's important that we take a closer look. One Parisian philosophe remembers a salonière this way. She could unite the various types, even the most antagonistic, sustaining the conversation by a well-aimed phrase, animating and guiding it at will. Politics, religion, philosophy, news, nothing was excluded. Her circle meant daily from 5 to 9. There, one found men of all ranks in the state, the church, and the court, soldiers and foreigners, and the leading writers of the day. So, an interesting thing to note about these salonières is that they did participate in the Enlightenment. Upper-class women were present, whereas lower-class women were not. Their role seems to be that of facilitators. They were the organizers and the party planners of the salons. They operated as conversation starters and argument breakers. But did they participate to the full extent of men? Most of the evidence suggests they did not. If only we could be a fly on the wall in one of these Parisian salons, we could gauge just to the extent women did participate in the Enlightenment. We do have women philosophes, however. If they weren't very numerous, they were significant. One of them is named Mary Astell. She's the first English feminist of her times. She published her thoughts in what is called a serious proposal to the ladies, published in 1696. She advocated the establishment of colleges and higher education for women. She writes, "But they, that is men, must excuse me if I may be partial to my own sex as they are to theirs, and I think women capable of learning as men are. and that it becomes them as well. She wrote another tract as well, Some Reflections upon Marriage. She argued that men have all of the advantages while women are subordinate. And what's interesting is that she uses the language of the Enlightenment to justify her claims. Let me show you what I mean. If absolute sovereignty be not necessary in a state, how comes it to be so in a family? For if arbitrary power is evil in itself, and an improper method of governing rational and free agents, it ought not to be practiced anywhere. If men are born free, how is it that women are slaves? This reminds me of the exchange between Abigail Adams and John Adams on the eve of the American Revolution, in which Abigail reminds John to remember the ladies, lest they foment a rebellion against them for not having representation. A second woman worth noting is Mary Wollstonecraft. She is an Englishwoman who observed the upheavals of the French Revolution in 1789. And when she saw all of the privileges and rights that men were giving themselves, she responded with a tract of her own called A Vindication of the Rights of Women in 1790. She argues, "My own sex, I hope, will excuse me if I treat them like rational creatures instead of flattering their fascinating graces and viewing them as if they were in a state of perpetual childhood, unable to stand alone. I earnestly wish to point out in what true dignity and human happiness consists. I wish to persuade women to endeavor to acquire strength, both mind and body, and to convince them that the soft phrases, susceptibility of heart, delicacy of sentiment, and refinement of taste are almost synonymous with epithets of weakness, and that those beings who are only objects of pity and that kind of love, which has been termed its sister, will soon become objects of contempt." So in other words, Mary Wollstonecraft says, don't be wilting flowers. Be strong, be tough, be educated, and take control of your own destiny, lest you become, as she says, an object of contempt to men. Mary Wollstonecraft argued so forcefully for women's emancipation that she drew criticism from both men and women. She lost social prestige when she refused to marry the father of her illegitimate daughter, Mary Shelley, and as you know, Mary Shelley went on and wrote Frankenstein. And we can't be done with our thoughts about women without considering Rousseau, once again the outlier. Rousseau is different from every philosophe he compares himself to, and in this case, he's different from all of the women who also comment on the state of women. For Rousseau, most people find him to their liking. He argues in his book, Emile, that men and women are just naturally different. Men are the stronger, the more intellectual sex, and women are the weaker, more subordinate sex. He writes, "It follows that a woman was specifically made to please man. If man ought to please her in turn, the necessity is less direct. His merit lies in his power. He pleases simply because he is strong. I grant you this is not the law of love, but it is the law of nature, which is older than love itself. If woman is made to please and be subjugated to man, she ought to make herself pleasing to him rather than to provoke him. Her particular strength lies in her charms. By their means she should compel him to discover his own strength and put it to use. This is what women are for, according to Rousseau. They're there to enhance the powers of men. They're not there to enhance their own power. They're there to serve men and to make men realize their full potential." We'll have a look at Pre-enlightenment Healthcare. Pre-enlightenment medicine was based on the text of Galen, who, as we know, got just about everything wrong, from the circulatory system to where the brain is located. Galen just couldn't get anything right. Nevertheless, he is the medical text of the day. He recommends bleeding for just about everything that ails you. This was, of course, to restore the four humors that he thought governed the health of the body. Well, once we hit the Enlightenment, cities begin to require licensing to practice medicine and surgery. The job of a surgeon used to be the same as a barber, and now special training is going to be needed. And you will ask, well, did it help? Denis Diderot, the compiler of the Encyclopedia, writes of the best hospital in Paris. Imagine a long series of communicating wards filled with sufferers of every kind of disease, who are sometimes packed 3, 4, 5, or even 6 into a bed. The living alongside the dead and dying, the air polluted by this mass of unhealthy bodies, passing pestilential germs of their afflictions from one to the other, and by the spectacle of suffering and agony on every hand. The result is that many of these poor wretches come out with diseases they did not have when they go in, and often pass them on to people they go back to live with. So, no, Enlightenment medicine did not dramatically improve the lot of patients. In fact, Enlightenment medicine is really not going to make major leaps forward until Louis Pasteur's germ theory is widely accepted sometime after 1877. Then we're going to start to see a lot of improvements being made. I also want to say something about pre-Enlightenment crime and punishment and attitudes towards criminals. In a word, before the Enlightenment, the treatment of criminals was medieval. The rack, the thumbscrews, the Iron Maiden, whatever gruesome device you can think of to inflict pain and shame, that was the way that people tried to deal with their criminals. Then comes a man named Cesare Beccaria. Beccaria is how we usually hear it pronounced. He is a philosophe who wrote a book called On Crimes and Punishment, published in 1764. So Beccaria writes, the end of punishment is no other than to prevent the criminal from doing further injury to society, and to prevent others from committing the like offense. Such punishments, therefore, and such a mode of inflicting them, ought to be chosen as will make the strongest and most lasting impressions on the minds of others, with the least torment to the body of the criminal. So he's suggesting here that the object of punishment is not to simply inflict pain, but to make an impression on the minds of others and prevent crime. He goes on, the torture of a criminal during the course of his trial is a cruelty consecrated by custom in most nations. It is used with an intent either to make him confess his crime, or to explain some contradiction into which he had been led during his examination, or to discover his accomplices, or for some kind of metaphysical and incomprehensible purgation of infamy, or finally, in order to discover other crimes of which he is not accused, but of which he may be guilty. He takes a very dim view of torture here, saying that it is a cruelty consecrated by custom, but has no real practical value. It should not be used to get people to confess things, because this is not going to give you a reliable confession. But pre-Enlightenment thought believed this. They thought that if you put enough pain on someone's body, that the truth would somehow come out. Well, now we know through modern psychology that the more pain you put on someone's body, the more likely they are to say whatever you want. Beccaria continues, it is better to prevent crimes than to punish them. Let's look at that again. It is better to prevent crimes than to punishment. This is his basic thesis statement. This is what he aims to accomplish through his writing and through his teaching. This is the fundamental principle of good legislation, which is the art of conducting men to the maximum of happiness and to the minimum of misery, if we may apply this mathematical expression to the good and evil of life. I want to point out that there is a philosophical germ here. It's called utilitarianism, and it's going to come to fruition in the thinkers such as John Stuart Mill, with believing that the aim of society is to maximize pleasure while diminishing pain. And this seems to be what Beccaria is saying with the treatment of criminals. we're not here just to inflict pain, but we are here to redirect minds and actions so that we can prevent crime from happening. We are going to look at an Eastern European development now called Enlightened Absolutism. And at first, this may seem to be a contradiction in terms. How can you be both an absolutist, which means you rule by an iron fist, what I say is the law, and how can you also be enlightened, which champions democracy, toleration, freedom of conscience, and things like that? Well, they do try to coexist in a number of people, and we will meet them all. First, let's have a look at Immanuel Kant writing on the enlightened ruler. He says, "A ruler who does not find it unworthy of himself to say that he holds it to his duty to prescribe nothing to men in religious matters, but to give them complete freedom while renouncing the haughty name of tolerance, is himself enlightened and deserves to be esteemed by the grateful world and posterity as the first, at least from the side of government, who divested the human race of its tutelage and left each man free to make use of his reason in matters of conscience. But only he who is himself enlightened, is not afraid of shadows, and has a numerous and well-disciplined army to assure public peace, can say, 'Argue as much as you will, and about what you will, only obey.' A republic could not dare say such a thing. A greater degree of civil freedom appears advantageous to the freedom of mind of the contrary, provides the mind with the room for each man to extend himself to his full capacity." So Kant suggests that rulers should not impose a religion, but allow within their realm for argument and discussion. They should essentially turn their realm into a giant salon or a coffee house. Rulers who do not allow for such freedom are afraid of shadows. In other words, they are, as Thomas Jefferson would say, illegitimate rulers in the first place because their rule is based on falsehood and not truth. Rulers should, or the question rather is, should rulers use force to impose order when things get out of control? Kant seems to say they should not. Argue as much as you will and about what you will, only obey. Kant says that in a republic, which a lot of Philosophes champion, the form of government called a republic, that a republic could not dare say such a thing. When you think of enlightened absolutism, or the enlightened despots as they're sometimes called, think of this acronym. It's called TRAP. Toleration of religious minorities. This is going to be a hallmark of the enlightened absolutists. They want to see minority religions tolerated within their realm. They want to see people stop executing them. Also, reform of government institutions. They want to make government more efficient. They want to make government serve the people rather than oppress them. And then, of course, there's they're absolutist. They're not going to be modern Democrats. They're not going to surrender power to the people. They do see themselves as paternalistic rulers who want to impose reform from above. And the last one there, patronage of the Philosophes. They're going to have people like Voltaire and David Hume at their court, at their dinner table, and they're going to send these folks money. And this is partly how a lot of the Philosophes are going to be able to survive without actual jobs. So here's our roll call of the enlightened absolutists. They are Frederick the Great of Prussia. As you know, Prussia is the largest state in what is going to become Germany. You have Catherine the Great of Russia. You have Maria Theresa of Austria. And then you have her son, Joseph II, also of Austria. So just a little reminder about geography. This right here is Prussia, as we said, the largest of the German state, and destined to become the banner carrier for German unification in 1870. But there it is right now in the 18th century. So the first guy that we're going to look at is Frederick II, also known as Frederick the Great of Prussia. As you know from previous units, he inherited a really strong state from his dad, Frederick William I. Frederick William had built up the largest army in Europe, but he nearly lost everything during the 7 Years' War, which took place in both Europe and in the American colonies, and in the United States we know this is the French and Indian War. And he thought that perhaps a more enlightened approach may be called for in administering his very large territory. He believes very much in a top-down approach to enlightenment. He writes, "I must enlighten my people, cultivate their manners and morals, and make them happy as human beings can be, or as happy as the means at my disposal permit." So he's going to allow his subjects to believe whatever they want with regard to religious and philosophical matters. So he is going to endorse total religious toleration. He's going to allow scholars within Prussia to openly publish without fear of any persecution. And he's also going to provide for education. He's going to simplify the law code to make it understandable to anybody who can read. He's going to abolish torture, and he's going to make judges rule without regard to class. So it's something approaching what we would say in the United States with the 14th Amendment, equality under the law. He's also going to invest in agriculture and industry in order to catch up with his rivals, England and the Low Countries. As you remember, these are the two countries that are leading the way in commercial agriculture. Frederick the Great never speaks of himself in terms of divine right. He shies away from saying, "I am the state," or any of those things that sometimes you hear uttered in France. Instead, he just says, "I am the first servant of the state. I'm here to serve my people." He opposed serfdom, but he does not want to anger the landed nobility, and so he's never going to take legal steps to abolish it. This wouldn't have been very wise because he cannot afford to make angry the landholding Junkers. That is what the landowning nobility in Prussia is called. They're called the Junkers. So if you take away their serfs, it's kind of like taking away the slaves from the antebellum South in America. There's a lot of capital wrapped up in those people, and you can't just take them away. But to be a good enlightened despot, he's going to say, well, I don't really like serfdom, but there's not much I can do about it. He develops a form of German government that's going to persist into the 19th century called cameralism. This is the view that monarchy is the best form of government. Democracy is not the best form of government. Republicanism is not the best form of government. Monarchy continues to be the best, but all elements of society should serve the monarch. Now, the monarch is not supposed to rule with an iron fist and oppressing people and doing whatever he wants like Louis XIV. The monarchy must use its power and resources for the public good, to enrich the public good. One must serve the king with life and limb, says Frederick, with goods and chattels, with honor and conscience, and surrender everything except salvation. The latter is reserved for God, but everything else belongs to me. Now, to illustrate this goal of the monarch serving the needs of the people, one really cool example will suffice. There in the middle of this painting, you have Frederick II of Prussia, and then you have these poor peasants all gathering around him. And what are they pulling out of the ground? The almighty potato. Frederick II introduced the potato as a way to feed his people, and he invested in its cultivation. This is an example of government, of big government, using a top-down approach in order to serve the needs of the people. Ironically, interestingly, conversely, France did not take on this step. France would not invest in the potato. And on the eve of the French Revolution, you see a lot of starving French people. And when Marie Antoinette appears on her balcony and supposedly says, "Let them eat cake," she's not saying let them go have fluffy pastries. She's saying, why don't they eat potato cakes? Frederick for all his enlightened pursuits, is at heart a elitist. He writes to Voltaire, "Let us admit the truth. The arts and philosophy extend only to the few, and the vast mass, the common people, and the bulk of the nobility remain what nature has made them. That is to say, savage beasts." So if I had to rank Frederick II on a meter of enlightenment or enlightened to just a plain old absolutist, I would say he's interested, but he's practical. He's skeptical of the people. He's not sure they can really handle all of the learning that perhaps he himself can. Returning to our map once again, I want to point out that this is Russia. And Russia is your largest landmass in Europe right now, but don't let that fool you. They're probably the most technologically and philosophically behind the rest of Europe. So this is Catherine the Great of Russia. She's an unlikely Russian ruler because she's not even Russian in the first place. She's a low-ranking princess from an obscure Russian town, and her father commanded a Russian army. Her mother, however, was related to the Russian Romanov family, which made her a candidate for marriage into that family. The Romanov family is the founding dynasty of the modern Russian state. So she marries into the Romanovs to a guy named Peter III, and by luck, her husband became the Tsar, and then she became the Tsarina. She made her ambitions clear. Later she wrote, "I did not care about Peter, but I did care about the crown." Catherine and her lover, she had a lover, didn't much care for her husband, and his three brothers then formed a conspiracy to overthrow her husband, Peter III, in 1762. Then Catherine becomes Empress Catherine II, but don't forget who placed her there. It was the landowning nobility. Her lover and his three brothers, they represent that cadre of interests, and so she's going to rule at the pleasure of the landowners. Now she is going to cater to the Enlightenment. Now, Catherine drank very deeply from the well of enlightenment. She issued her instruction, or a new law code for Russia, in 1767. This is the most radical proposal for reform until Vladimir Lenin, the famous Bolshevik, the communist, comes about in 1917. Let's take a look at some of its suggestions for the future of Russia. Catherine's instruction suggests, what is the goal, or the true goal of monarchy? Not to deprive people of their natural liberty, but to correct their actions in order to attain the supreme good. Well, who wrote that? Who is this inspired by? How about John Locke? How about this one? The equality of citizens consists in this, that they should be subject to the same laws. Who inspired this one? There you have either Locke or Rousseau, both of whom suggested that all citizens, regardless of rank, should be subject to the same law. How about this one? The use of torture is contrary to the dictates of law and reason. Even mankind itself cries out against it and demands loudly the total abolition of it. You can remember this one. This is Beccaria, who is informing this part of Catherine's instruction. Torture is a bad idea. Capital punishment is a bad idea. We should have all citizens be subject to the same laws, and the goal of monarchy is to direct the state toward those ends. Catherine's instruction goes on with the big one. She writes, that law ordains that every man shall be judged by his peers and equals. For when the fate of a citizen is in question, all prejudices arising from the difference of rank or fortune should be stifled, because they ought to have no influence between the judges and the parties accused. She's actually suggesting that differences based on birth and wealth be completely erased from the law code. And it's an extension of that, like we said, Enlightenment value of equality before the law, which finds its expression in our 14th Amendment. Of course, she's making anybody with either one of those very nervous. People with noble rank or people with a lot of money are going to oppose this. Well, Catherine is not going to get very far. Her instruction is issued in 1767, and in 1773, you get a massive rebellion to the east. It's called Pugachev's Rebellion. Pugachev is a Cossack, which is an ethnic group in eastern Russia. He's a soldier, and he sparks a huge uprising in 1773. Now, he proclaims himself the true Tsar of Russia and takes the name Peter III. If you recall, that's the name of Catherine's murdered husband, and it's unclear what he means to say that by that, but he is taking on the name of Peter III. And he takes it upon himself to issue orders to completely abolish serfdom, taxes, and forced service into the army. Pugachev's rebellion is the largest peasant rebellion of the 18th century. It rattles the crowned heads all over Europe who begin to look at this and go, what's going on? This Enlightenment thing, this is getting out of hand. It targets landowners. 1,500 estate owners are going to be killed. That's a huge bloodbath of nobility. Pugachev is going to demand an end to serfdom, taxes, all class distinctions. Now, these are some of the things that Catherine was already leaning toward before Pugachev's rebellion took place. Pugachev himself is going to be captured, tortured, and killed. Not a very Enlightenment way to meet your end in 1775. And there's Pugachev at the top of the gallows there, about to meet his end. An interesting thing to note is that during the Soviet era in 1972, 1973, somewhere around that. The stamp says 1973. Good. The Soviet Union issues this postage stamp with Pugachev on it, celebrating him as the nascent hero of the working man, sort of drafting him into the workers' paradise that Vladimir Lenin and then later Joseph Stalin would later proclaim. Interesting. I wonder if Pugachev would enjoy being associated with the communists. Well, it doesn't take too long for Catherine to reverse course. Look at what she writes in her Decree on Serfdom, 1775. So this is after Pugachev's rebellion. The governing Senate has deemed it necessary to make known that the landlords, serfs, and peasants owe their landlords proper submission and absolute obedience in all matters. Ooh, hey, wait, I thought you were enlightened, Catherine. What's going on? According to the laws that have been enacted from the beginning of time. Oh, wow. So what happened to the decrees? What happened to equality before the law? She goes on. And which provide that all persons who dare to incite serfs and peasants to disobey their landlords shall be arrested and taken to the nearest government office, there to be punished forthwith as disturbers of public tranquility, according to the laws and without leniency. So everything that Catherine had declared about equality before the law, about the end of torture, about reforming the tax system, all of these good Enlightenment proposals are suddenly flushed down the toilet with one fell swoop, and it's all because Pugachev has scared so many people. She learned her lesson. Don't encourage the serfs. They cannot handle this kind of freedom. Perhaps Frederick II was right. Lesson learned. Keep a strong military force on the frontiers. Keep a buffer zone in order to prevent from invasion. And don't alienate the landlords. You're gonna need their support. Frederick II knew this. He knew that he could not oppose serfdom publicly. He knew that he couldn't take any legal steps to curtail serfdom, because serfs are money in people's pockets. Serfs are an economic investment. And if you alienate the landlords, then you are going to alienate. You're going to alienate yourself. You're not going to have the support that you need. So I would characterize Catherine the Great as ambitious but restrained. She had a lot of very far-reaching and noble ideas for equality under the law, the abolition of serfdom, religious toleration. But in the end, the landed nobility forced her back into the Dark Ages. Ironically, it was Pugachev himself who would have benefited the most from Catherine's reforms, who acted as an agent of his own re-enslavement, or his people's re-enslavement, and his own execution through taking things a little too far, shall we say. We're going to look at the last of the empires that are touched by the so-called enlightened absolutists, and that would be Austria. A word about Austria. Austria encompasses more ethnic groups than any other territory in Europe right now. It has more different ethnic groups, languages, religions, proto-national histories, and things like that than any place else. It's part of the Holy Roman Empire, or rather I should say parts of it are part of the Holy Roman Empire, but you also see nascent nationalities of themselves who don't consider themselves to be part of either one. So ruling the Austrian Empire is going to be quite a problem for folks like Maria Theresa and Joseph II until it finally breaks apart after the end of World War I. This is Maria Theresa. She inherits power from her father, Charles VI, who is part of the very powerful Habsburg family. They have branches all over Europe. They have branches in Italy. They have branches in Austria, and they have branches in Spain. Now, she's interested in reform, but she basically remains a conservative. She did reduce the power of the nobility over the serfs, and she revamped the tax system, but she didn't go too far. She essentially left the old system in place. Now her son Joseph II, on the other hand, is going to take things a lot further. Now, I like this picture of him, Joseph II pointing to his mother at some map. Here are my plans, mother. I'll tell you what I'm about to do. So Maria Theresa's son, Joseph II, I'm calling him Joseph II, the not-so-great. He comes to the throne in 1780, and he is going to set about making the most enlightened reforms of all of these enlightened despots we've been talking about. He put forth an average of 690 decrees a year. His mother, Maria Theresa, had made fewer than 100 a year. Joseph II writes, "I have made philosophy the lawgiver of my empire. Her logical applications are going to transform Austria." So you see, he's got really big plans. He goes for complete religious toleration, even for the Jews. Now, this is a radical move at the time, because a lot of people are going to say, yeah, we should give religious toleration to Protestants, or we should give religious toleration to maybe Christians like Catholics and Protestants. But to go as far as to enfranchise the Jews and to say they too have the right to public worship, this is more than a lot of people can handle in the 18th century. And the Catholic Church pushes back at Joseph II and strongly opposes his reforms. And at length, he's forced to repeal his religious toleration for the Jews. He tries to centralize administration. One of the things he tries to do is make German the official language of the empire for the nobility, but the nobility and the peasants both push back at this. Like we said, Austria is a very diverse empire, and it's got a lot of different people in it. And in order to get along in government, you've got to speak a lot of different languages. He tries to make German, which is spoken by most people, the major language, but people don't appreciate this, and they push back, and he's forced to repeal that decree. He also abolished serfdom. He's the only one who took the step to do this. Abolished serfdom as a legal institution. And it did last throughout his lifetime, but his successor will undo this and reinstitute serfdom. Joseph II died a bitter and broken man, and before he went, he ordered that his tombstone be inscribed with the following inscription: "Here lies Joseph II, who is unfortunate in everything that he undertook." Poor man. So I would characterize Maria Theresa as curious but ultimately conservative, not making very many far-reaching reforms. And Joseph II, her son, we're going to say, is the most radical, going as far as to completely abolish serfdom, but just about nothing he tries to undertake is going to stick in Austria. So he's the most radical, but he's ultimately going to be the least effective. That's going to conclude our lecture on the Enlightenment. I hope you enjoyed yourself, and I'll see you all in class.